We're so thankful you're here, and just today I have the privilege of closing out what has been a 7-week series, and it's been, I know through the conversations we've had with several of you, so many teenagers especially, my wife and I lead the student ministry, so we get to have a lot of those conversations, but I know it's been a powerful series, and the name of the series is A Light in Dark Places, and we have talked about a bunch of things: anxiety, depression, worry, negative thoughts, burnout, and today we're going to be talking about trauma. And what's interesting about all of this is through all of Dan's teachings, I actually have already found the cure for mental health. You taking notes? Pull it out, prepare yourself here. It's the cure for mental health. It's 3 words: go to Iceland. Write it down if you're taking notes, you're watching online. That's transformative right there. Go to Iceland. In the middle of this series, my wife and I took a trip over there with some friends, and I just found that anxiety doesn't exist over there. I don't know. It's just not even a reality. Worry wasn't a thing, but then you come back and you're faced with, no, I'm just messing with you on all of that. But there is some really cool things we've been learning in this series, and I think here's the first one. It's a growing battle, mental health is. And I want to be very careful here, I think that a lot of us are actually losing that battle. It's become so normalized to deal with these things that I think we just started accepting them as, okay, this is life in the 21st century in the United States. And in reality, we are being crushed by our circumstances and crushed by the traumas of the past when God actually wants to take us into a place where we can experience healing and we can experience freedom. So let's just get that out of the way. We need to quit normalizing all of these problems. Would you agree with me? It's time we go to the next level and learn to live above those problems. And I think that's really just the heart of this whole series. We're dealing with all of this stuff, but it's not the end of our story. It's not the end of mine. I'll go ahead. It's not the end of yours. There's more story to unfold. And I don't know, for some of us in here, maybe that causes us to be full of hope because we're excited about the day where things can be at peace and things can be normal again. Today, we're going to talk about trauma. Trauma, you can go ahead and go to Psalm 27 if you want to flip there in your Bible. That's where we're going to land today. We'll get there here in just a few minutes. But trauma, there's 3 types of people in the room. There's those who have experienced trauma, those who are experiencing trauma, and those who will experience trauma. And some of us in here are probably all 3 of those things. In fact, some of you are probably already pinpointing times in your life where you walked through this or you experienced this or this happened, and it sent you into a season of emotional distress. And I'm not here trying to cause you to fear about what's to come. I'm just here to remind you what Jesus has already said in John 16. He said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. He's basically like, strap your seatbelt on, buckle up, because you're going to have trouble. He warned us that it was coming. So I don't want people to go into a place of fear. I just want us to understand that if we're ready for it, it won't have the influence on us when it comes, as opposed to if we're not ready for it and we get blindsided by it. And I also recognize that there are some traumatic situations that are in this room and those watching online that are just really unimaginable. Maybe it was disappointment. Maybe you just had, and I'm not talking about what happened in Knoxville yesterday. All right. Sorry, is that too soon? Man, I'm not talking about what happened in Columbia, Missouri yesterday. All right, it's a tough day for the state of Alabama, right? But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about true disappointment where you had your hopes or we had our hopes anchored in something happening a certain way and then it did not happen that way and we were left crushed because we were disappointed. That's a traumatic thing, right? When we experience seasons of disappointment, I think of seasons of, I hate to even have to mention this morning, but seasons of abuse. Trauma right there, man, right? Doesn't matter what kind of abuse it is. It inflicts deep emotional, sustained distress on an individual and really spirals them into a season of struggle. It's trauma. I think of seasons of, or maybe an instance of betrayal or abandonment. I'm a part of a fatherhood initiative, and we've interviewed over 75 hours of dads, many of those who were abandoned by their own dad, and they're 50, 60 years old today, sitting here telling us the trauma that they've carried for 30 and 40 years because their dad walked out, or their dad wasn't there. or their dad chose work over their games, or their dad chose this over that and just had his priorities out of whack. And we've seen firsthand, I've sat in the room for 75 hours as men, grown men, had tears pouring down their eyes because of the agony and the trauma of abandonment and of betrayal. Maybe it's a season of loss where you go through and you lose someone you love. Probably everybody in this room has dealt with that, but that's trauma. That's agonizing. You had this hope that life would look this way, and now life doesn't look this way anymore because he or she is not here. We have accidents, and I've seen this happen with friends that I'm close to, and even after 10 years of student ministry, seeing kids lose friends that are teenagers to a car accident or something, and the trauma that's afflicted on a family after walking through something like that. Perhaps it's the trauma of other people's words. We can say words are never going to hurt us all we want to, but words have a whole lot of power. And when other people choose to use those words to destroy, it inflicts trauma upon an individual. Maybe it's just a season where you just can't catch a break. Anybody ever walk through a season like that? It's like you just can't catch a break. One thing after another, trauma. And I'm looping all of those circumstances today into that one word. I'm not here to give you a medical explanation of what happens in the brain. I'm no scientific expert, but I am today going to give us a biblical pathway for how we can make the transition from a season of trauma to a season of freedom. And the first thing we've got to understand right here is that season of freedom does exist. We don't have to, contrary to what you might feel, you don't have to stay in this traumatized state for the rest of your life. There is a way, there is a path that can take us there. And so if you're in any of those seasons, today is going to be helpful for you. Are you ready? If you're ready, shout yes. Awesome. Let's roll. To begin, we really have to look back at the beginning of time because trauma did not exist in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, God created the heavens and the earth. He took 5 days to create everything that we see today. On the sixth day, God created man and woman, put them in this garden that was called Eden. In that garden was perfect harmony, perfect tranquility, perfect serenity, just perfection. It was quite literally heaven on earth. It was not until Genesis chapter 3, when man and woman disobeyed God, that they experienced trauma. Therefore, trauma is actually a byproduct of sin. Did not exist in the very beginning of creation, but it exists today. In one moment when Adam and Eve sinned, they experienced an influx of traumatic things. They lost their relationship with God. They experienced shame on a whole nother level to where they had to go hide in a bush and hide from the God that loved them and created them. They had this emotional and psychological trauma that just burst onto the scene the moment that sin entered the garden. And you and I today face trauma because the effect of sin has lingered through the age. And today we face trauma as a byproduct of sin that entered the world some several thousand years ago. So the first thing we've got to see this morning, and it's my first point if you're taking notes, sin is a big deal. Sin is a big deal. And God is intensely passionate He is intensely and passionately against sin. Why? Not because he's some militant, dogmatic God, but because he is so passionate about us, our well-being, and us fulfilling the purpose that he's put on our lives, and he knows that sin is going to be the very thing that keeps those things from happening. Sin is a big deal. We experience the trauma that we experience today, all of these situations I just named, because sin entered the world in Genesis chapter 3. Point 2, if you're taking notes, trauma is a door. Everybody shout door. Trauma is a door. So when a traumatic event happens in your life, that's not where it ends. It actually opens a door to an influx of problems, to an influx of struggles, to an influx of issues. If you're abused, and I don't want to roll past that because that's like makes you want to vomit right there. But if you've dealt with abuse and growing up, like that was a door that opened you up to a world of insecurity, a world of shame, a world of lacking your self-worth. You with me? A world of anger and frustration and confusion. Trauma, abuse was the trauma that opened the door to all of those things. If it was disappointment, the trauma of disappointment opened the door for you to experience grief and pain and frustration and hopelessness and a lack of purpose. If it was betrayal, you were wondering, right? Betrayal opened the door for you to then experience insecurity, lack of self-worth. Do we see how trauma is a door And the things that come through that door then wreak havoc on our lives. It does not just stop with trauma. And here's what happens. We end up standing in a situation that we did not ask for. We're just surrounded by a world of darkness. It's like a dark cloud that you just can't see out of. We didn't ask for this. Sometimes it just happened to us. Sometimes it just happened and we were nearby. What do we do with that? That's the question this morning. What do we do with that? How do we make the transition out of that? Out of this darkness, out of this disoriented state, out of this confusion, this lack of purpose, this lack of drive, don't want to get out of bed. How do we come out of this funk? How do we come out of that and make the transition into the place of joy and freedom and healing that I'm describing to you this morning? We got to look at the life of David to really understand it. David, we all know, he's one of the most famous, really historical and Christian figures ever known. David's the same boy that was a shepherd in a field, and there was a bear and a lion, and he's tending to his sheep, and a bear and a lion in separate instances come up to take his sheep. And what does David do? The Bible says in 1 Samuel that he grabbed the sheep and grabbed the bear and ripped the sheep out of the bear's mouth. That's pretty wild. Like that would go viral today on TikTok and Instagram. That's pretty crazy, right? It's that same little boy. He did that with a lion. He did it with a bear, but he was also the last of 8 boys. He was the youngest. And because he was the youngest of 8 in the house of Jesse, he dealt with a lot of bullying from the top down. He was looked down on. He was the one that wasn't expected to accomplish anything. He was the least. So he's dealing with all of that. And then we all know that as a little 11, 12, scholars disagree on the age, 11, 12, 13 years old, makes his way to the valley of Elah, where 2 nations are standing, and he actually slays a giant with like a little leather sling and a rock from a little creek nearby, and defeats a nation. This is the David that we're talking about this morning. He would then go on to become the second king of Israel. He would then go on to complete the construction. He would then go on to lay out the blueprints of the construction of the temple before his son Solomon would take it on. That's the David we're talking about this morning. And while David experienced some enormous triumphs, right? Imagine when that giant falls and there's probably millions of people watching on, and you're the guy that did it, right? That had to be a high moment in his life. That had to be a highlight for a 13-year-old boy that's in 7th grade, right? Although he experienced some incredible highs, he also experienced some brutal lows. And I want to talk about 2 of those as we gateway into Psalm 27 here. Before we get there, Saul's jealousy. Saul was the first king of Israel, but when David was coming up to become second king of Israel, Saul was extremely jealous of David. People liked David. People were following him, and Saul's starting to get insecure in his kingship. He's getting arrogant in himself. And so what does Saul do? He does what anybody would do, right? No, he doesn't. He puts a bounty on David's head and asks 600 of his own men to go find him and kill him and not stop until the job is done. When we hear that story, we think, okay, David was on the run for a few weeks. No, David ran in the wilderness for 7 years. As 600 men with put a valued bounty on his head. He's hiding in bushes. He's hiding in caves. He's camouflaging himself to the desert. 7 years. I'm 28. I'd be 35 by the time I stopped hiding. That's a long time. 7 years running, traumatized, because he had been serving and he had been very humble toward King Saul, and now the man that he had been serving had put a bounty on his head to take him out. How many of you know that's a traumatic circumstance? But it didn't just stop there with David's life. Later on in his life, and it's in, if you're taking notes, it's in 2 Samuel 16. David finally comes to the throne, and about 30 years into his 40-year reign, David's own son gets jealous of him. His son's name was Absalom. And Absalom set up a coup d'etat of his own dad to overthrow his kingdom and to take him out. Some of you dads in here will be able to understand that your own son turns his back and rallies an army to take his dad out so that the son can become king. And David once again finds himself running through the same wilderness he ran through 30 years back, hiding from his son who wants to kill him. What ended up happening at the end of that battle was Absalom lost his life and David stayed king. But how did he feel about it? Really lost his son. Sure, he's king. Sure, his army won the battle, but he lost his son. Sure, his son turned his back, but he lost his son. David finds himself in a place of trauma. And throughout these different experiences, David uses some incredible wording. Let's go to Psalm 6, if you would, Blake. David writes these 3 Psalms right here, referencing some of these situations that he's in. In verse 6, he says, I am weary with my groaning. Watch this. All night I make my bed swim. I drench my couch with tears. Go to Psalm 13. How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart? How often? Daily. How long will my enemy be exalted over me? He may be 5 years into this 7-year run at this point. He's like, how long? Talk about one season after another. How long am I going to have to deal with the trauma of these circumstances? Go to verse 3. Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. In other words, open my eyes or I'm not going to make it. I can't go any further. Last psalm here, Psalm 22. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. Verse 16. Dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Verse 17. I can count my bones. They look and they stare at me. Do we see the agony of the trauma David's in? It was in the middle of this agony. Watch this. He had his moments where he's having to put language to what he's dealing with. But it was also amidst this thick cloud of darkness that David wrote Psalm 27. And that's where we're going to land today if you want to go there with me. I want us to be sure we're clear on that. David did not write Psalm 27 on the back end of this. David wrote Psalm 27. A lot of scholars believe he's on the run from Absalom during this. And he pens, to me, what's one of the most incredible Psalms in all of the Bible. In verse 1 of Psalm 27, the Lord said, David writes, the Lord is my what? Help me out. The Lord is my light. I just think that's beautiful for the way he began that, because all he had been describing was darkness. All he had been describing was how much longer? I can't make it through. Where's my purpose? Why is my son doing this? Why is Saul trying to? There's 600 men over there. They don't know I'm buried. I'm sitting here camouflaged on this hillside. Why? Here, he says, the darkness may be reality, but that is okay. Why? Because the Lord is my light. Here's the cool thing about light. We don't appreciate light until it's gone. How many of you ever lost power before? You appreciate light in those moments, don't you? I'm talking about lost power without a backup generator. Light becomes valuable when it's not there anymore. But like this right here, there's lights on right now. There's a screen on right now. It's just kind of like, okay, well, this is normal. We take it for granted. But when it goes away, it's like, wish I had that. I think about the hurricane victims with Milton and Helene. Some of them lost their house entirely and just their world's been turned upside down. But some of them still have their home but without power for weeks. But what's it like the moment the light comes back on? How many of you know that's a good moment? Everybody stops what they're doing. You hear the fan kick back on because it was plugged up and you forgot to turn it off. Y'all know what I'm talking about? TV flips back on, lights are up, and it's almost like life can start again. It's almost like you felt handcuffed the whole time. It's like you couldn't go forward. But when the moment that light comes back on, life can start again. And it's just this way, but on a whole nother level with what David's talking about. He said, I've been walking in darkness, honestly, for years. But I have now seen that amidst that darkness, the Lord is my light. And his situation came back on. His life could begin again, and he got a glimpse of that light. He also said, not just the Lord is my light, but he's my salvation. Everybody shout salvation. He's my light, and he's my salvation. Salvation, the word just means deliverer. He's the one who delivered me from trouble. Don't forget, David's somewhere on the hillside struggling through a circumstance right now. He's struggling through trauma right now. The Lord is my light, and he is my deliverer. I bet David is recalling the times when God delivered him in the past. I bet he's remembering the lion and the bear and the giant when he faced those impossible circumstances. And he's reminding himself in this new circumstance, hey, don't forget, God delivered me from the trauma of the past, and he's going to deliver me from the trauma of the present. And I think sometimes that's a message for us. Sometimes when we get so buried in a moment of darkness, the best thing we can do is look back and remind ourselves of the time that he came through in the past. And all of a sudden, faith starts to rise in us as we were reminded that he's also going to come through in the present. He asked quite honestly a comical question there It's a rhetorical question, but he says, if the Lord's my light and my salvation, then whom should I even fear, right? And the rhetorical answer is no one. No one. He keeps going, not only is the Lord my light and my salvation, but the Lord is also the strength of my life. The NLT uses the word fortress. I love that word. It's so visual. The Lord is my fortress. He's my safe place. He's my secure place. He's not some wimpy little tower off in the distance. He's a fortress. And he re-asks the question, of whom should I be afraid? And the rhetorical answer is nobody. Here's what's cool about this verse right here. He did not write, the Lord gave me light and gave me salvation and gave me strength. What did he say? The Lord is my light, is my salvation, and is my strength. Why is that important? It's not just a word play. It's important because I'm concerned that we as the large church have reduced God to someone that just gives us something when we need it. And I actually got to speak at a school to about 300 or 400 students on Wednesday. And I'm going to share with them the 5 things that stand out to me from 10 years of student ministry. And one of those things is this. We reduce God to using him to get what we need. And while God does give us what we need, he's not just sitting there giving us light, giving us salvation, giving us strength. He's actually giving us himself. And him being near us, when he gives us himself and stands with us, when he steps into our situation, in that moment we then have everything that we need, because everything that we need is found in him. That's transformative there, because it changes our prayer life from, God, I need this because I'm struggling with this, to, Father, I need you to come stand with me so that we can do this thing together. And in that moment of union, in that moment of fellowship, we then have everything that we need. David's confidence continues here in verse 2. Watch this. When the wicked came up against me to eat up my flesh, my enemies and foes, they did what? They stumbled and they fell. Here's what's cool about this verse. Those of us who have endured trauma, we feel like we're the ones that are face down in the mud all the time. We feel like we're just crushed, dealing with the effects of life. But here, that's not the picture David gives. The picture here is it's actually the wicked in the end that are going to be the ones that stumble and fall, and the righteous will be the ones that stand. So I say, here's what I say to us. I say it's time to rise up. What do you say? I say it's time to stand. The wickeds are the ones that are down. The righteous are the ones that are standing. We need the type of confidence that David has. He continues in verse 3 with this confidence. Even if an army sets up camp against me, which, by the way, did happen. He's probably seeing that happen. They're coming, and he's like, okay, even though an army may get camp against me, my heart shall not what? My heart won't be afraid. Though war rises against me, in this I will be confident. So the question becomes, where in the world did David get this confidence? Where did he get it? He gives us the answer in verse 4. David says, one thing I have desired of the Lord, and that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord. How long? All the days of my life. David got this confidence from the Lord. And to anyone who's dealing with the circumstances I'm describing, here's your pathway to freedom right here. David, in the middle of his trauma, resolved in himself that he was going to set one thing as a priority, to seek the Lord for all the days of his life. To know God all the days of his life. And that can sound churchy and be whatever, but I'm convinced it's the most powerful thing we can do in trauma, is to actually seek the Lord with all that we've got. What if that's really the gateway to freedom? What if we're just kind of halfway going through it? What if we actually got serious, like our life depended on it, because it does, and said, it's time for me to seek the Lord with all that I have. And what does he do in the temple? He beholds the beauty of the Lord, and he inquires in his temple. And here's what happened in verse 5 in David's life. As he set up this pursuit, as he resolved in himself that I'm busy, sure, I'm second king of Israel, sure, I have a lot of responsibility, but there's one thing I'm going to do above all else. I'm going to seek the Lord all the days of my life. And here's what happened. In the time of trouble, shout trouble, in the time of trouble, he shall hide me in his pavilion. Now, this pavilion here is not the wooden little roof thing with no walls that we know as a pavilion today. The word pavilion here in Psalm 27 is actually the innermost part of a camp. So picture like a 1,000,000-man army spread out over a piece of land. The innermost part of that camp was called the pavilion. It was the place where the king dwelled. And David is saying here, when he set up his pursuit of God in the middle of his trauma to seek the Lord, God hid David in the pavilion, in the innermost place, in the safest spot, in the secret place of his tabernacle, he shall hide me. But that's not all that God did. He tucked him away into a pavilion, but he also set David's feet high upon a rock. Keep going to verse 6 right here. So the picture, David has been tucked away into the centermost piece of a camp, lifted up high on a rock. Verse 6, and now, David said, my head is lifted up above my enemies all around me. In trauma, we feel like we're face down in the mud, but this story ends a different way. David chose to seek the Lord. God lifted David to a new place. The wicked stumbled and fell. David looked down upon the enemies he used to look up and be intimidated by. David's head was lifted up. He saw from a new perspective. He was able to see the enemies that used to crush him, but now David is the one that is standing. And it ends remarkably. David writes, therefore I will offer sacrifices of joy in this tabernacle. I will sing, yes, I will sing praises to the Lord. The pathway from trauma to freedom, are you ready? Is when you get a resolve so deep in your heart that you're going to seek God until you find him. And when you get that resolve in your heart and you spend your days seeking the Lord, he tucks you in to the pavilion of his camp. You felt vulnerable, you felt unsafe, you felt exposed, you were struggling, you were battling disappointment, battling abuse, battling frustration, whatever it was. But now that you've resolved to seek the Lord, he put you in the pavilion and kept you safe. And not only did he do that, he lifted you high on a rock so that you got a new perspective and were able to then stand in victory over the enemies you used to be crushed by. That's good stuff right there. That's the pathway to freedom. The question is, what are we going to do with it, right? God's heart is beating to take us out of this slump. I'm thankful that one psalmist wrote that he's close to the brokenhearted, right? He's not just out and about letting us deal with our problems. He is near. His heart is beating to transition us into a place of hope. And I'm not saying that this place is where you don't deal with that stuff anymore. Some things, man, it just feels like you may deal with them for decades. Here's the difference. You don't live in submission to them anymore. You're victorious over them. And you're not crushed. You're standing. You end the same way David stood, high on a rock, honoring the Lord, worshiping the Lord. And there's no better place of freedom than that place right there. What an ending, right? What an ending. Could have been it was a traumatic beginning, but it could have been a traumatic ending, but it wasn't because David chose to seek the Lord. I want to end today with a story. This story changed my life when I heard it several years ago. There was a military pilot who was trusted to go and test out a new high-altitude aircraft. They had been assembling this high-altitude aircraft, and the pilot got assigned to go test, right? I don't know about you. If there's one thing I don't want to be the guinea pig on, is test flying a high-altitude jet. But the pilot said, I'll do it, and he takes the plane up, and he begins testing everything out, but he notices about midway through his flight, he hadn't quite reached the high altitude that he's testing yet. He notices some electrical failures on his screen. And he hears some racket in the back. And what you got to know about this jet is because it was still in its beta phase, it had everything it needed to fly. But the interior of the plane had not been yet built out. There's wires laying everywhere. There's no seats. It's just like a giant exposed cargo jet. And they're testing it out. He hears this racket, sees the electrical failures on the screen. I'm sure it was a freak out moment for him. He's probably at 30 or 40,000 feet trying to climb even higher. He runs to the back to figure out what it is, and he sees a little rat. Oh, it's not a little rat, a big rat, gnawing through some of the electrical lines. And the rat was in an area where if he chewed through some of these lines, it was going to compromise the plane's ability to stay in the air. Now that moment of panicking, now he's like, maybe I shouldn't have been the guinea pig either. But he had a quick decision he had to make. How was he going to keep the rat from chewing through those necessary wires while also flying the aircraft? I think what most of us would have done would be to fly the plane back down and get it on the ground as quick as possible. Let's see how fast. Let's just do a dive. Let's put this thing on the ground, figure out the problems, fix the wires, and then we'll be good to go. But not this pilot. This pilot chose to take that aircraft to the altitude that it was built to fly. At that altitude, the air was so thin that the rat died on the spot because it had no air to breathe. Why is this powerful? Why does this apply to trauma? Well, because some of us that have walked through trauma are doing everything we can just to fly the plane, but it feels like every time we turn around, there's something else gnawing at us. Something else trying to take our plane down, something else trying to ground us. And we have to resist the urge to return to the ground. Although it feels safe, we can't go back to the place of complacency. What we've got to do is give the Lord permission to actually take us higher. Why? Because if he can take us higher, he's taking us to a place that the things that we've been dealing with can no longer live. He's taking us to an altitude where we can thrive, but that rats can't live. We've got a choice to make this morning. As we close out this incredible series, are we going to let God take us to the place that he took David, high upon a rock? Or are we going to, in and of ourselves, try and get back on the ground and tuck in and cling? I told the staff beforehand, 50,000 feet with God is safer than being on the ground without him. It's scary up there, man. You ever look out, it's like, but as long as he's there. David even said, this same David wrote in Psalm 23, said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And in verse 4, he says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I won't fear. Why? Because you're with me. And I just think that's where we've got to land this morning. He's with us. So why in the world would I be afraid? He is my light. He is my salvation. He is my fortress. It is time we press through trauma and into a place of freedom. That's my final point today, if you'll put it up there. There is a way out, but the only way out is through. We've got to bust through the issues and allow God to take us to that place of freedom. Would you stand with me as we work toward a close right here? Before we pray, here's what I want to say. Jesus gave his life for this moment. He gave his life to actually create a place where we could be safe with him, where we wouldn't have to live exposed and vulnerable to the effects of these traumatic things that have happened to us. But Jesus gave his life with that in mind, that we would have a safe place we could stand. But there's some people in here, I believe, who've never given your life to that Jesus. And I want to give you the opportunity to do that this morning. The second thing I need to say is, there are people in here who have given your life to Jesus, but I think it's time we recommit to a new level of seeking God. What do you think? I think we've just got routine and caught up in the church-going thing, and I think it's time that, hey, we really need to seek the Lord. And what we're going to find when we do is he's going to set us high on a rock, and he's going to tuck us into his pavilion, and we're going to begin to experience the peace that he died for. Would you bow your heads?